Engagement can be defined as an active intellectual involvement on behalf of students. Learning is not a passive process. Traditional views of learning tell us that when a student is in a classroom setting and a professor is standing in front of the room and delivers a piece of information, that piece of information magically floats across the sky and enters into the student's mind via funnel. And we know that learning is not that easy or that simplistic a process.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is, whoa, literature can be pretty amazing. It can take you to places you've never been, it can expose you to ideas, it can plant some seeds that might not have been there before, but it's up to you as the reader to do something with that, to either be critical of what you're reading or to be accepting of it, but knowing on what terms you're being accepting of that piece that you're reading. Does anybody want to play devil's advocate and say, good Lord, enough with reading?
In contrast to that, more progressive pedagogies and constructivist views of learning tell us that students need to grapple with information in order to make sense of it and in order to make it their own. For example, students who enter our program have a set schema as to what they think defines effective instruction, and this vision of teaching is more often than not determined by the experiences that they've had as students in classrooms of their former teachers. And when we expose them to progressive pedagogies that might run counter to what they think they understand about effective teaching, oftentimes they experience some form of resistance. And in order to help them work through this resistance, we need to offer them time to ponder and make sense of this new information.
What I'm going to ask each of you to do is reach into the handy-dandy manila envelope and grab a sheet of paper and then just take a peek as to what it says. Your sheet of paper will describe a role. Right? There are 6 different roles in our fictional community, and your responsibility will be to envision yourself in that role shortly.
When students are actively engaged, they're much more likely to retain the information that they're learning because they're able to tie it into the schematic understandings that they already possess. It becomes a part of their way of knowing as opposed to something that they're just memorizing and regurgitating back for the sake of the instructor.
And before we enter into the activity itself, well, you'll have a chance to enter into this character and have a conversation, I want to give you the chance to sort of figure out your person's perspective. Just take, I don't know, about 10 minutes or so to talk with one another and generate ideas that you think will support whatever position you will ultimately have to enter into. So this will give you a little bit of practice, a little bit of information on your side before you dive into the actual role.
From my perspective, students can learn an awful lot from one another. This doesn't necessarily remove the instructor completely from the classroom setting. I think that's a tension that many instructors face when they do relinquish some control and step back a little bit from the classroom experience. We as instructors need to learn to balance our role as members of a classroom community as well as authority figures, content area experts who can support our students by scaffolding their knowledge and their instruction over time.
We are going to create for today an open meeting for community members in which focus groups that have representation from each group are present.
From a student's perspective, I think engagement oftentimes is seen as teaching that keeps them awake, that keeps them focused on the task at hand. But more often than not, I think we don't give students credit. I think they do have a pretty keen sense of understanding and awareness about what engagement looks like, even if they can't articulate it in a really clear, coherent way. I think for most students, engaged instruction involves relevance, and students are able to see how the information that they are being given that they themselves are trying to make sense of might have applicability outside the 4 classroom walls.
I loved seeing so many of you assume perspectives that I know don't really jive with how you view the world. It's really nice to see you having sort of to wrestle with that and argue so articulately and powerfully for beliefs that don't necessarily map onto your own. And for those of you who were arguing your own side, I already knew you were going to be great in that capacity, so that was really well done. But what I'm wondering is, what, in your opinion, were some of the most compelling arguments made on both sides of the issue? So if you are somebody who is a very strong component of the classics, why would you argue that they are an integral part of a literature curriculum?
When students are engaged in their learning, Oftentimes they'll leave a classroom still hanging on to the burning questions that were posed or that arose during the classroom conversations prior. What I've found in my own students' experiences is once that seed is planted, it often crops up in a variety of other settings. And students will come to me and say, wow, I saw on television something that related to what we were talking about in class, or I overheard a conversation with someone that related to what we had discussed in class. And I think that is the direct result of students finding themselves engaged and really connected to the information and the content that is being discussed.
He knew that most young men made nothing at all of giving a pretty girl a kiss, and he remembered that the night before, when he had put his arm around Maddie, she had not resisted. But that had been out of doors under the open, irresponsible night. Now, in the warm lamplit room with all its ancient implications of conformity and order, she seemed infinitely farther away from him and more unapproachable. Ethan Frome. Edith Wharton, right? Raise your hand if you loved it. Raise your hand if you liked it. Raise your hand if you hated it. Raise your hand if you've never read it.
I think there are several strategies that instructors can employ to encourage engagement on behalf of students. One would be using multiple methods and multiple modalities to ensure that instructional methods are meeting the needs of diverse learners who come to us with different backgrounds and different ways of making sense of the world.
Sometimes I think it ain't none of us pure crazy and ain't none of us pure sane until the balance of us talks him that way. It's like it ain't so much what a fellow does, but it's the way the majority of folks is looking at him when he does it. Anybody know what it's from?
A second strategy instructors can employ in encouraging engagement on behalf of their students is to relinquish some sense of control in the classroom. And for faculty members who have been trained to profess by profession, it's difficult, I think, sometimes for them to allow students to have more ownership and control over what is going on in the classroom setting. And when we allow students to take ownership over their learning and have some control over their understanding, I think they find and appreciate our willingness to trust them as learners. It would be very simple for an instructor to stand in front of a room and tell students what it is he or she expects students to come away with after a given lesson. But when we ask students to make sense of it themselves, it forces them to assume some responsibility for their learning.